Hello, welcome to another episode of History Hag. Alex and I are incredibly excited again, but there is a special reason why we're so excited. Alex, tell us why we're so excited.
Because Dorman's here. Yay!
Yay!
So for once, I mean, you all know Dorman, Andy Dorman. He's down the pub every week. Most glorious hour was undoubtedly when he was the Roastmaster General for the Greatest Britain thing, where he just basically slated your top 10 brilliantly. But Dorman, you are a serious historian, aren't you?
Well, I wouldn't go that far. I'm a historian, sure, but serious is a whole different thing.
So we have invited you to come on to level up our Irish history, because it's been pretty woeful. Apart from we've had one sort of general programme, and obviously you bring the Irish to most of the pub sessions, but we're going to do a neat little session on your speciality today, aren't we?
Hopefully, yeah.
Okay.
Plan.
yeah, this is the plan. Whether it goes to shit or not, we will find out. Okay. You focus on the 18th century. You refer to it as the best century. What was the situation in Ireland in the 18th century? I'm guessing the English were being mean to the Irish.
Yeah, things were not going so well for the poor little Irish. That old joke of the 800 years of English oppression. This fits nicely right into that. So in the wake of the 9 Years' War or the League of Augsburg or the Williamite War, depending on what field you're studying, the situation in Ireland is probably best described as tense. You're in a position where Ireland has a religious minority being in a position of power compared to the religious majority, where if you look at somewhere like, I don't know, France in the same century, you've got, French Huguenot Protestants are the minority and they're being suppressed, whereas in Ireland you have the opposite way around, where Catholics are the ones being suppressed. That war I mentioned earlier showed what could happen if there were a Catholic uprising, and as such, the new English King William and his Protestants and the Irish Protestants wanted to find a way to suppress the Catholics and keep their own sort of power in check, keep their own position. And as such, they enacted something known as the penal laws, and that kind of sums up the 18th century, these penal laws. So, go on. Sorry.
So I was going to throw something really random in there, but keep going. Keep going.
I thought it was going to be something to do with the pronunciation of penal.
Yeah, probably. She's already laughing. So really your story that you're telling today starts with this 9 Years' War you've mentioned, doesn't it? What is it?
Yeah. Exactly. So that war, it's kind of an extension of a European war. It's like a separate theater of it, where this is James II having a Catholic son, and his Catholic son annoying Parliament, so Parliament ship over William of Orange, and William of Orange kicks James out. James ends up fleeing to Ireland. Reason being is he put in place there earlier a fellow called Richard Talbot, who was Catholic and quite pro-Catholic, and he'd started putting a lot of Catholic sympathizers or Catholics in high positions in Irish society that they didn't occupy before. This really concerned the Protestants. But when James came over, it actually suited him because he had kind of a second base of operation, so to speak. So William of Orange and his army invades, and you essentially have an English war being fought on Irish soil for a couple of years between 1688 and about 1691-ish. So this war, it doesn't really go particularly well for James. It opens with the very famous Battle of the Boyne, where you have William's army of French, Irish and British managing to defeat James's army of French, Irish and British.
I know that name, that battle name.
Yeah, that's the famous one that the lads in Ulster like to trot out on the 12th of July.
Mm-hmm. There's a lot of British, Irish being thrown here. I'm getting confused.
It doesn't get any easier, and everyone is still confused to this day, so just roll with it.
I'm rolling with it.
So speaking of the Irish, we give James a nickname after this battle because he runs away, so James is known as James the Shit. In Irish history thereafter. The joke is he flees to Dublin and he says to a woman he bumps into, "My army has run away," and the woman says, "Well, it seems your majesty has won the race." Which is a devastating put down to the monarch and kind of sums up attitudes to him at the time. He wasn't particularly
pretty wank, isn't he?
He's such a wank. Like, he's just the most depressingly wet king.
There's that moment in history where he almost got his head taken off by a cannonball, isn't there? And the world potentially might have been a better place.
That was William.
Oh, was it?
That was on the other side of the Boyne. So William at the start.
Oh no, I thought this was on a boat.
Oh.
This is a naval thing with James II. It may be fiction. It may be something I've read in J.D. Davis's stuff. But yeah, he tells a similar tale.
Oh, God, it would have been so much better if he died.
He sounds like a wet lettuce, really.
Yeah.
He's also the reason that there's the act of succession and all that nonsense about Catholics, isn't there?
Mm-hmm.
There's, for someone who was so small and insignificant, there's like a massive hangover from his being around.
Yeah, and he completely screwed Ireland for at least 150 years afterwards. So thanks, James. We fucking love you.
So why does the British Army go into Ireland at the time?
Okay, so at the end of this war, they signed something called the Treaty of Limerick, and the Jacobites who supported James are basically told you can either sack off to France or you can live in Ireland, but we're going to basically imprison you or put you under a lot of restrictions. So a lot of the Jacobites flee to France, where James has set up a proxy court in Saint-Germain, which proves to be the biggest thorn in the French king's side in his entire reign, because it's basically a hive of scum and villainy, and like bandits go raiding constantly, and like Irish people just become really annoying in France. However,
Alina's like, this sounds like fun.
Why am I okay, I'm saying this. Sorry, keep going.
So back in Ireland, the Catholics who remained are viewed as a threat. And there's a chance that they might rise up again, or there's a chance that the Catholics who fled to France will come back and invade. So between the penal laws I mentioned earlier, which were designed to suppress the Catholic interest, and this potential invasion, they decide to put 12,000 men in Ireland. Now, when I say they, it's not just the British and the British deciding we need to suppress Ireland. This is the Irish Parliament itself voting for and paying for this military deployment. So you have a situation where you have the Irish government paying for British soldiers to be in Ireland to keep the Irish Catholics in check.
That's
so
not going to come back to bite them in the arse, is it?
No. At one stage it peaks at, I think, 1,600. And even during the Troubles, I think the Troubles peaked at maybe 15,500 or something like that. So it does outrank the Troubles in terms of military deployment, and no one's really heard of it. Now, they weren't just sort of moved in and told deal with it. They were given one of the widest and most extensive and modern networks of barracks in Europe in which to live. This is the first time it had really been attempted on this scale. So they were both urban and rural. You've got them based in cities, and then also I suppose small posts dotted around the countryside to keep Tories and all that kind of thing in check. So it's a massive drain on the Irish government's finances, but they think it's worth it given the climate in the 1690s and early 1700s.
Because I'm so confused. I don't know how you're kind of like unwinding all of this, and I thought I had a problem with my part of history.
So the Irish, don't they? The Irish think that there's a benefit to having the British there, but clearly the British aren't going to go unless there's a benefit for them as well. So is it like mutually beneficial to have this massive presence in Ireland?
Sort of, yeah. So for the Irish perspective, if you're a Catholic, you have no input into this anyway, so it doesn't matter what you think. For the Irish Protestants, they view it as a good thing because it's, keeping the Catholics in check, and they view it as, British presence here, and it's worth it. For the British, it's a place to keep their army, because particularly after these, the 9 Years' War and then subsequently the War of the Spanish Succession, you've got the sort of birth of modern armies as we know them today, with actual regiments and large numbers of soldiers being maintained in the military. And in Britain, there was serious adversity towards keeping men in towns. They didn't want them to have barracks or anything like that because they thought it would lead to public unrest. So Ireland is a really convenient place to keep them. They're just over the Irish Sea. And in addition, the French and Spanish in the past have had tendency to invade Ireland. So why not keep them there just in case they do end up invading? So it's sort of it's a convenience more so for the British, but for the Irish it's seen as a little bit more important.
So talk to us. What was life like for the army at the time?
When they're in Ireland, boring as shit.
well, that's the easy answer.
Is this like the posting no soldier wants?
I wouldn't go that far. I think it's the posting that they might be relieved to get if they weren't the best soldiers in the world, because you're guaranteed to not get a disease or have to be killed by and scalped in North America, or, you're not being sent out to India or anything like that. It's a relatively peaceful assignment. The problem was, outside of your training maybe and barracks life, there isn't very much to do, and you're still in somewhere where there's a fairly hostile population. It's better for officers because they get to spend time with the local aristocracy, and they're viewed as this like new hot commodity on like the marital market and this kind of thing. Whereas for the average soldier, it's fairly dull. And most of the accounts that I've come across come from officers, and they are very, very disparaging about the Irish. Drink obviously features. I'm really proud of my country that the heritage of being alcoholic stretches back to the 1700s, probably further.
So that is basically what there is to do.
Yeah, they've all got theories about why the Irish drink. And this seems to be like a constant source of discussion. So one guy who's a bit of a knob called James Augustus Aughton, he believes that everyone has already heard everyone's stories before in Ireland. So the only way to make them tolerable is to be drunk.
That's a really lame reason.
Oh, he's a complete knob. Like his account of living in Ireland is just a rugby tour. Like he goes around ruining Irish culture. So he visits a castle with his best friend where there's supposed to be his ghost. His best friend then sleeps overnight in the castle to prove that there is no ghost, just to give a finger up to the local guy who said there was a ghost there. He goes out. Go on, sorry.
No, that's sad. That's just what a prick.
Yeah.
It's like Brits on tour, isn't it?
Yeah, he gets a pet otter at one stage.
What?
His friends requisition whaling boats from Parliament so they can go whaling for the sake of it. And he describes Ireland as exposed to bleak westerly winds. It seems incapable of producing anything but rabbits, rocks, bogs, and land was all that nature wished him to work on. He's a dick.
So what problems do they face then? I'm guessing that the army face a problem with misbehaviour, because if you give soldiers nothing to do, they get up to japes, don't they?
Oh yeah. Again, drinking, big issue. Because the reason, the soldiers themselves, they had easy access to alcohol. Whiskey in particular was really common. In fact, most of their assignments when they were in Ireland were tipping over whiskey stills. So there was always going to be access to it. And there's a doctor called, I think, John Bell, who does this account of why is it that all the regiments in Ireland have massive ulcers on their legs, and apparently it's due to the amount of whiskey they drank. So that was a serious problem. In addition, just as a broader issue, the army itself isn't made up of Irishmen. It was actually illegal for both Protestants and Catholics to enlist for most of the century, because Catholics, obviously, you don't want to teach them how to shoot straight, and Protestants, you need them in Ireland to suppress the Irish, because the army was under a constant sort of rotation, whereby regiments would be moved, be it to America, and then regiments would come in and replace them, or even they'd be moved around Ireland. So there's no real sense of settledness. So it's impossible for the men to settle down, and they're constantly at unrest, and even the locals are kind of on edge because new people will come in and maybe they don't have as good a relationship with this regiment as the previous regiment. So it's a really sort of unsettled environment in which to live. So you've got mutinies. Desertion is a massive issue, particularly at the beginning of the century. And the way desertion is reported typically comes in newspapers. In the 1730s, there's the Dublin Journal posts hundreds of desertion reports, and some of them are absolutely beautiful because they really give a good sense of what the soldier might actually look like. So my personal favorite is John Steele, purely because it sounds like a porn star.
Yeah.
From
go on, tell us about him.
So he was 5'10", 25 years old, and he was a glazier, which is an unusual profession at the best of times. He had a ruddy complexion, black curly hair, but a stoop in his shoulders. But my favorite bit is they say he is pretended to a knowledge of painting and mathematics. Imagine being such a bullshitter that you get called out for it in a local newspaper.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
Why was he bothering to bullshit?
It's just part of his character.
Okay.
They'll also have, if he was particularly, if they spoke with a lisp or a certain accent, they'd include that. It's anything that can make him identifiable. So clearly this guy was such a bullshitter that you can identify this guy if someone comes up to you and says, I know how to solve that mathematical equation.
With a list.
Yeah.
Oh, and a limp. Let's throw the limp in there just for fun.
Of course.
I love it.
And when they deserted, often they desert with a lady friend. One example is this desertion of Philip McCran from Sligo, and he deserted with Mary Welch, a barrack maid, a lusty, fresh, full-faced woman of a middle size, a little inclined to fat, wears a dark olive gown.
I love this. I was going to say, like, they must have ravaged the local female population.
Yeah, and I think some of the female population were very much on board with it. In Ulster in particular, they seem to have they liked a man in uniform, but marriages were actively discouraged, because if you married and then you had to ship out, as the regiments often had to do in Ireland, particularly if they were based in somewhere like Cork that was a port, it added another layer of administrative difficulty. So what you often have is there's one case where a regiment is told that it's going to ship out, and all the soldiers try and get married as quickly as possible with the people they've already married, because they know that once they ship out, they're never going to see their loved one again. So it's kind of a sad thing as well, because it's that unrequited love, or forbidden love, not unrequited.
There's got to be something positive that they experience, though. It can't all be negative.
Did Ireland gain anything from this, from being used basically as a massive holding camp for bored soldiers?
Sort of. I mean, as I said, they did get to marry local ladies. It's a fairly easy gig. Yes, you have to deal with riots, but, you had a barracks and that kind of thing. For Ireland itself, it gave them an enemy in a way. I mean, particularly towards the end of the century, the army starts to become incredibly unpopular, particularly in Dublin. And you have a phenomenon developing where you have soldiers being targeted in a ritualistic sort of terror attack sort of format. It's known as hawking. So what would happen is the soldiers, particularly if they're isolated on their own throughout the city, they'd be attacked by butchers who would hamstring them. And they did this to over 100 soldiers over the course of the 1770s, 1780s. So this shows the dissatisfaction that the people had, and the army were just, that there was nothing they could really do about it, because they couldn't go out and hunt them down. And if they tried to do that, typically they ended up shooting civilians anyway, so it just made things worse, because they were really bad at dealing with riots and rioting as a whole. So, the positive elements to it are difficult to unpack at the best of times, and that's kind of like the aim of what I'm trying to do with this whole thesis, is see if there's any positivity to it.
This is interesting to me. So this is your PhD thesis as well. So why research this period? Like you say, it's pretty much ignored, and nobody talks about it. Why do we need to bring more attention to it?
Well, I think that it's criminally under-researched, despite the British Army being a really popular period or thing to research, or subject of research. And I think that a lot of it rests in laziness, because it is still the British Army. It's the Irish military establishment, but the soldiers themselves that make up the British Army. So if you're going to do a history of the British Army, you can usually consign it to maybe a small section or a footnote and leave it at that. Whereas for an Irish historian's perspective, it's not something they actually want to look at, because it is the occupying army. And I'm not going to say that Irish historians are all nationalists, because we're not. But maybe that does feature into it. Maybe it is sort of like there's a nationalist bent to it, that it's unpopular to study this subject. And there's one quote from a historian called Thomas Bartlett, who basically describes the Irish Army as a byword for inefficiency and ill discipline. And that has dominated any kind of mention of them since. But I think there's a lot more to it than that. I think a better sort of reflection of it would be that Ireland provides a really nice, like a focused viewpoint or a case study of wider issues within the British Army. I think it accentuates the good and the bad far more than anywhere else. Because if you look at somewhere like Gibraltar, which has been looked at, or the Caribbean or North America, you've got a very different circumstance. Whereas with Ireland, you're still close to home, but it's still that garrison experience and that sense of being slightly outside the norm. So I think it just accentuates everything that little bit more.
Is there a long-term legacy of this massive occupation of Ireland?
Well, as a result of the soldiers' incompetence, I guess, or their inability to act properly. The rebellions that take place in the late 1790s, such as the 1798 rebellion, directly lead to the Act of Union. And the Act of Union writes the Irish Parliament out of existence, combines the two, gets rid of the Kingdom of Ireland, and the Act of Union obviously leads to, well, it's still in effect today in a way in Ulster, where you have the six counties forming Northern Ireland. So one could draw a line all the way across. It'd be tenuous, but one could arguably make that call if you wanted to. But I think it's difficult to really plot the legacy because so little has been done specifically about them.
Right, you've got to have more anecdotes about the army. Come on, you've got to tell us and make us laugh just a little bit more.
Okay, that I can do. So everyone in the army at some stage seems to spend time in Dublin, and Dublin had the best barracks. It was the premium barracks. It was the Savoy of barracks. It's still there actually. It's now a museum. But the reason why everyone spent time in Dublin was that's where all the gangs were, because Dublin had its own Gangs of New York scenario with the Gangs of Dublin. Much like it is today, the north side and the south side hated each other. So you had the butchers who formed the Ormond Boys, and you had the weavers who formed the Liberty Boys. So one was on one side of the river, one was on the other. And these groups used to have organized gang fights in the middle of Dublin city centre. So they just agree, we're going to meet up at this green space and we'll kill each other this Sunday.
Brilliant. Oh, now a leader's interested. Now I see a film.
Yeah,
I'm on the edge of my seat and I'm like, tell me more.
So these guys, they would meet up armed with koshes, axes, all sorts. The weapons got progressively more violent as you progressed through the century. And the soldiers were tasked with suppressing these. But the problem with Ireland was it didn't actually have its own riot act. So there was no legislation behind them dealing with these gangs. So what would typically happen is the soldiers ended up becoming the third gang. So the two gangs would meet up and fight, then the soldiers would turn up, and then the gangs would turn on the soldiers. And then you had the soldiers chasing the gangs through the streets and trying to kidnap the leaders, or more likely just shooting at the leaders or the gang itself and just opening fire on them. And this gang warfare fluctuates throughout the century and never really goes away. And you have incidents where the police force is so utterly corrupt that oh yeah, I'm talking 90% corruption. At one stage they do cull the police, but from 2000 they only keep 200 of them. That's how bad it was. All the rest were involved in these gangs. So the police is incapable of doing anything, and the burden falls entirely on the military, who have no capacity to deal with anything like this at all. So when you've got a gang of soldiers who are pretending to have a knowledge of painting and mathematics versus...
I just love that you chuck the authorities in and it just becomes... I'm seeing the Battle of the News Crews in Anchorman.
Yeah, that's exactly what it's like.
Just more people keep showing up.
Yeah, and except the people who show up now have guns. And they try not to shoot at them. But oftentimes what will happen is that the process seems to be point your bayonet at them, and if they keep rioting, shoot no ball, just fire your musket with some powder, and that'll scare them. And if they keep rioting, shoot above their heads, and then if they keep rioting, shoot at them. And what's interesting, there's one case where it occurs in Dublin where a woman is the one who keeps egging on the soldiers by throwing stones at them and encouraging everyone else to throw stones at them, saying, don't worry, they don't have any ammunition, they're not going to shoot us, how dare they shoot us? And she gets shot 4 times. Good effort, but you maybe do a little bit more research before you commit to that.
Did she die?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, I know it's a stupid question. I mean, some people can survive being shot 4 times, but I'm curious to know if oh my God, sorry. There
must have been a moment when the 3rd and 4th bullets went in when she just thought, shit.
I've made a terrible judgment of character. But,
yeah.
Surprisingly, the army aren't charged for her murder. The rioters are, because they think the rioters were to blame for the army needing to shoot at them. So that's sort of you can see why people started to get more pissed off with the army as the century wore on.
Just a bit.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say, how do the Irish public react? So obviously we've got some girls that like it, but how do normal Irish people feel about this sudden arrival and mass intrusion?
I think for a lot of them, it's at first it might be a sense of relief. It's you're just coming out of a fairly long period of conflict, and only 40 years beforehand, the country had been completely torn apart by all kinds of warfare and Cromwell and all of that. So it offered, at first anyway, stability. And it gave, retailers really enjoyed it because it gave them a new market. So you had flourishing of, particular alcohol businesses to a degree, but also others like trading cloth and that sort of
thing. Yeah, if you owned an off license, you thought it was great.
Oh yeah, absolutely. In fact, there's instances where sergeants in the army would set up off licenses next to the barracks, which I think is like kind of a cruel thing to do, to get your soldiers drunk and then on the parade ground next morning beat them for it. But anything for your kicks, right?
Yeah, anything for a bit of extra money.
Yeah. Well, I think on the whole, though, that's sort of one of the more surprising things from the research I've done. The Irish population didn't seem to mind at first. But as the century wore on, they realized that the army wasn't actually doing what it was supposed to be doing. So Ireland is invaded very, very briefly in 1760 by about 200 Frenchmen, under the command of a man called Thureau. So
they
Thureau,
just get lost. That sounds very out of character for the French to put in that much effort.
Yeah, well, he's sent off with a fleet of 5 ships, and he sails into the Irish Sea, and he's given a choice: attack either Scotland or Ireland.
His men attack the first one.
Yeah, his men vote. It's like, make a decision, Thureau. Come on. His men almost mutiny, so he has to attack Ireland because it's easier. He lands near a place called Carrickfergus in Belfast. The local garrison abandon the townsfolk and hold up in a castle. The townsfolk flee to Belfast, and there's a very brief siege where the garrison eventually falls. And it's sort of the only time that the Irish are ever properly invaded, I suppose, by the French. Eventually, he sends like envoys to Belfast, and Belfast just pay him off. They say, we'll give you whatever you want, just leave, and he does. And then he's sunk off the Isle of Wight and killed there. I actually have what he was paid with. So this is what it takes to get the French invasion out of Ireland. Okay. You need 40 hogsheads of wine, 20 hogsheads of brandy, 30 barrels of peas, 3 bags of onions and garlic, 60 cows, 60 barrels of butter, 4 barrels of vinegar, 4,000 weight of biscuits, 1,000 weight of tobacco, 600 weight of candles, 400 weight of rice, and 100 weight of sugar. That's all it takes.
I love that there's the token amount of onion and garlic in there. Quick, they're French, throw that at them. That'll make them go away. Throw garlic at them like they're vampires.
Just, yes, get out of here. Come on, take your garlic and go.
Oh God, he does not sound like one of France's great naval leaders, does he? So how does this come to an end? So Britain didn't obviously use this is a one-off, this massive presence of troops in Ireland. You said it's the biggest one ever. So how does it come to an end?
It eventually, with the French invasion, and after that, an organisation crops up called the Irish Volunteers, which is lots of Protestants and also Catholics who are trying to show loyalty to the English crown, and they think there's a lot of reasons for it. It's to do with them losing America and everything like that, and they want to show that they won't do the same thing. But these volunteer soldiers start doing a lot of the jobs the army was doing better. So the army becomes less and less popular. Then coming towards the end of the century, after 1798, as I said earlier, you have the Act of Union. So as part of the Act of Union, the Irish Parliament no longer exists. They were the guys paying their wages, so they just become incorporated into the British Army. Okay. So that's sort of where my research sort of cuts off, is that it's no longer its own separate thing. It's just part of the same garrison, so everything's just basically centralised.
What's brilliant is then that's basically where Zach's research starts, with all the crime and punishment in the British Army.
Exactly, and I've gone back and forth with him about this, and that's why my century is better, because without my century, his century wouldn't exist.
Okay, yeah, you do. I know you have a WhatsApp nerd group, don't you? Literally, where you guys are just like at it all the time with your army, crime and punishment, 18th century stuff, and where the argument about whose is best wins.
Oh yeah, and obviously it's me, because I've got women who are tending to fat and wearing olive green dresses while he just has flogging, like, which is more entertaining.
Yeah, this is true. Sorry, Zach. I'm going to go with Dorman on this one.
And Dorman's got a lovely accent.
Diddly-idle, diddly-idle.
Which is it? What was we were reading last night, that the director of that hideous film has come with a comeback, hasn't he? Where he said, and I believe the guy's Irish, where he has defended the Emily Blunt's accent and Jamie Dorman's accent, and said that Irish accents are so difficult to understand that they have to do the accent that way, otherwise the world wouldn't understand them. To which you said,
bollocks.
It does sound absolutely ridiculous. Apparently, they intended to have Irish accents that bad because they were making Irish people more palatable for an international market. I think the other argument that there's an Irish pub on every street corner in every town in the world, you don't really need to make Irish things palatable, do you? People like them already.
See, the problem is, I don't know when that movie is set, because they're talking about freezing eggs and all that kind of thing, but they dress and talk like it's the 1800s. So it's really, there are issues. Issues are raised.
I'm Googling it now. When is, what's it called?
Wild Mountain Thyme. It's upsetting that I know that.
Did you know what's upsetting as well is that someone was saying that there is no Wild Mountain Thyme is a Scottish thing, an Irish thing. Someone was saying that it's actually a Scottish thing.
Oh, I'm so upset. Oh no. There are some good films that do good Irish accents. This just isn't one of them.
This is not one of them.
I think the worst offenders are probably found in that film, Michael Collins. That's particularly terrible. Liam Neeson's obviously fine, but some of the others in that film are just god-awful.
Yeah. Dorman is available for accent coaching. And he's going to start with Clive after last night down the pub. A clownish fiddle soundtrack gives way to Blunt's ethereal rendering of Wild Mountain Thyme. The implied historical period based on the famine-era fashion and archaic dialogue is around the 19th century.
This doesn't bode well. I can't wait to see it personally, because I'm sure I can concoct a drinking game out of it or something like that. Yeah,
we will have to have a session down the pub. Someone is actually trying to claim that it's a satire now.
That's just the ultimate defense. I was joking.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. Gotcha!
Yeah, the whole time I was japing.
Dorman, thank you so much for joining us and basically
confusing the shit out of you.
Yeah, pretty much. With some very interesting stories about slightly plumpy ladies.
No fat shaming here.
No fat shaming here. I'm sorry, I can't. I'll keep laughing.
It is a very tumultuous, complicated history. Dorman's going to have to come back and give you more on either side to put it into perspective, I think.
Happily, yeah. There's a lot to it, and I'll happily talk about it again.
Outstanding. Thanks so much for coming on.
Oh, thank you.
Join us a bit later on when we will continue our celebration of all things Irish. We will be having a special Down the Pub session where we look at Ireland's greatest moment, and we let Dorman judge. But because we couldn't let him have all the fun, we made him judge with Marcus. So Princess and Dorman trying to eke out of us the best moment in Irish history. Don't miss that. And then tomorrow we have a real treat for you. Dusty Nichols is with us to talk all about his new book, which is Miss Spain in Exile. The big thing about this is that Miss Spain in Exile, 1938, was his mum. He has taken a memoir that she started about fleeing the Spanish Civil War, seeing Europe on the eve of World War II, and then moving to America, and he's turned it into a book about her life, and it is a fascinating story. You can find out also about how she was almost a Bond girl, so don't miss that one.
When our guests join us to talk about their work and their new book, the 45 minutes or so they spend with us is just a taster of all their efforts. So to this end, we have launched our very own bookshop on bookshop.org, where you can find our guests' latest and greatest books. You can support them, and you can support History Hack too. 10% of every sale via our bookshop supports the podcast and allows us to keep at it and bring you more amazing guests. You can find our bookshop at bookshop.org/shop/hack history, or just search on bookshop.org for us under the shops bit. Thank you for your continued support, and here's to your next great book.
We are now on YouTube. We are posting all of our new episodes on there, and we have our own channel, and we are gradually posting all of the back episodes because we have been made aware of the fact that you can only find the last 100 on some platforms. So you can go and listen to your heart's content and laugh at the cartoons and have a great time. So do go over there and subscribe.